All right, this is my review of Carla Hurt's The Lover's Curse, a tiered reader of Aeneid 4. So, what is The Lover's Curse? And what is a tiered reader? What is the Aeneid? So, Aeneid, of course, is the famous poem by Virgil, famous Roman poet. And the Aeneid is the epic adventure and poem, epic story of Aeneas, who escapes during the Trojan War from Troy. It's about him sailing around and trying to find a new location for a new Troy, which of course is going to be eventually the new city of Rome. The Aeneid is a long poem separated into different books, and The Lover's Curse is focused specifically on book 4, which is about the relationship between Aeneas and Dido, who is the queen of Carthage during this part of the story. It's also about the way the gods interact with humans, and in many ways it's kind of a proxy battle between the different gods, using Dido and Aeneas to wage this war between these different factions of gods, which is really interesting to see in the poem. And so what's interesting about this book, The Lover's Curse. It's not a reader, it's a tiered reader. So what does that mean? So a tiered reader is when you have 4 different levels of difficulty. And the basic idea is that you read the first tier, and that gives you enough information to read the second tier, and then the third tier, and then the fourth tier. And by the time you get to the 4th tier, that tier is actually the original language of the Aeneid. And so hypothetically, if you just follow up the tiers, you're reading the real poem in the original language, and it's providing kind of a framework and scaffolding to get you up there. I'll show you an example of what that looks like in a second. So let's take a look. So this is the first chapter of the book of Carla Hurt's book. So this is chapter 1. Basically, every section actually starts number 1, typically with pictures that explain some of the vocabulary in the section. So for example, ecce ulnus is describing, you can look at the image, you can see, he's talking about an injury or kind of something like that. And then we have another one to explain another word, regina amore vulnerata, or saucia, which means to be injured. And so here we're using a cognate with English. Is that a cognate with English? I don't even know. But it's a word that's a little bit easier to recognize, meaning injury. And then saucia, I think that's pronounced right, I don't know. That is a little bit less common or a little less obvious what it means, but we can make the connection between the cognate and the pictures that we see here. And of course, there's some more pictures, some more simple sentences just to explain some of this vocabulary. Here's another example. Ma terawi suos pullos alit. Alit significat qui bundat tetamat. Explaining the word alit. And then lastly, equi herban carpunt dedunt. And so that provides you kind of the base vocabulary that you're going to need to read either some of these tiers or the final original language. And then her first tier that she provides, this is as she describes in her introduction, this is the tier with the simplest language. I would describe this like textbook Latin language, kind of like what you would see in Familia Romana or Cambridge Latin course, Oxford Latin course, that kind of thing, where it's not really how Romans would describe things, at least in my experience. It's grammatically correct and idiomatic. It's just explained in a way that's not as dense as authentic text, I would say. It's not trying to squeeze all the information into just 1 or 2 words. It's sort of more spread out, explained out, a little bit clearer. If you've read Familia Romana, pretty straightforward. Simple language. The idea here is just it's kind of a paraphrase, I would say, or sort of like a summary of it, trying to explain in simple language. And sometimes it will give some backstory, or if there's an allusion to a god or something like that, or maybe information, cultural information, it might be explained here or in the next stage. So it's very simple, just to give you what the story is trying to express in this part of the poem. Now, the second step, gradu secundus, this is where it imitates more the structure and the grammar of the original text, but again, it might explain some concepts that aren't obvious in the original. It may explain some allusions, things like that. And it also swaps out the original vocabulary with easier or more common synonyms. And so it's meant to be, again, very prose-like natural speech or natural writing. That's the idea. And so it's definitely more difficult than the previous one. And then gradus tertius this one is basically all the original language. It's exactly the same as what Virgil originally wrote. It's just rearranged in kind of a more straightforward prose-like word order. So it's purely about word order here. Exactly the same. It's basically the same kind of word order and stuff in the previous step, but now we have all the original vocabulary. It's just all put in there. But again, because it's laid out in a more straightforward syntax, it's much more comprehensible than the original language. And then the final step highlighted here, this is the original language. This is exactly what Virgil wrote over 2,000 years ago. The only difference between this and the previous tier is simply that it's put into the proper word order. So instead of in a more prose-like, you could say, word order, the syntax is much more poetic. Adjectives and nouns, for example, are spread apart, and it's just it's predictable, I would say, but it's just less prose-like. Let's put it that way. So yeah, so those are the 4 stages. Or technically you could say 5, because there's sort of preliminary vocab, picture, explanation. There's the first step, just simple textbook Latin prose. There's the second step, which is more prose-like, idiomatic, I guess, Latin, how people typically might explain things, but with simpler synonyms. And then the third step is all the vocabulary, all the same grammar, just syntactically rearranged to be a little more comprehensible. And then finally, the last step, where it's all the original language. Now the question is, how do you actually use this to read the book 4? And Carla Hurt provides several potential strategies. My original strategy when I read this book, and I did read it, of course, is I was going to read Gradus Primus, and read that for every single thing first. So I'll just read just this, and then I'll skip all this stuff, go to the next Gradus Primus, and then so on. So I'm basically reading the simple entire story first, and then the idea was I would go on to the second step. I would go to Gradus Secundus and read all that in a row, and then so on. And then the idea would be that I'm basically just getting the story in progressively more complicated forms. But with the advice of the editor, actually, of this book, I decided to just read it in book publish order. So start with first tier, second tier, third tier, and then finally Virgil. And I think ultimately that's the best strategy for some people. And I'll explain who might use that strategy maybe a little bit later. But the reason I recommend that is simply because the tiers are sort of like links in a chain. And it's basically progressively sort of holding your hand all the way up to the original Virgil. And so if you read it as a set, it works really well to get you up there. So again, the first one is just introducing you to the basic story, then the basic grammar and structure, and then it's the original vocabulary, and then the original word order. And so step by step, if you follow that, my experience was that for the vast majority of these sections, I could read the original Virgil and understand it well, very well. And that was very exciting. That was very cool because it felt like I was actually doing it. I'm reading real Virgil, real Latin, real poetry, and actually being able to visualize it and experience it and just read it off the page. We're not doing sentence diagrams. We're not thinking about grammar even. We're just reading word for word, the whole thing, and just being able to visualize and appreciate the poetry. And so that was very exciting. When I'm reading it, I'm like, I'm actually doing it. This is great. Now, I guess I'll say overall, like what are my positives and negatives, my overall view of the book, now that I've explained it kind of what it is. My overall view is that it's an excellent learner text, intermediate text. I would say this is up there with the very best, meaning ad alpes, historiae, epitome historiae sacrae, First Latin Reader, Ritchie's Fabulae Facules, Roma Aeterna, etc. Like those, that approximate level intermediate readers. It's right up there, I would say. I would say it's worthy to be part of that canon, of the high quality intermediate text. So the text you're reading when you're not quite at the level of exclusively reading native content, original authentic content, but you're beyond Familia Romana and like the basic beginner textbook. So for that purpose, I think it's excellent. And it's just a delightful experience. All the pictures that you see here, even though obviously a modest art style, it's actually kind of charming, the style with these little pictures. They're not only helpful in terms of comprehension, but they're just fun to look at. They're just really cool. And sometimes you see some pretty decent detail. Again, it's not winning art awards, but I think that's to its benefit, that there's something charming and fun about these drawings. And there's a dry wit to some of them, which you'll notice as well. So I very much enjoy looking at the pictures. And just reading the different tiers was also delightful. It felt like my knowledge of Latin was just growing progressively as I rose through the tiers. And again, for the vast majority of these passages, it felt like I was actually reading the real Virgil for real, just reading it off the page. And so for that, I would say it was extremely successful. In the text, I'll show you something. Now, in the back of the book, we have the whole book 4 published with macrons, which is cool. And you get the whole book. And so what you can do is once you've read all the tiers, you read the whole book, you can just try it out. Just read the poetry. Don't think too much about the grammar. Don't think too much about the vocabulary. Just read it as if it's like English. Just read word for word and just experience it. The question is, what will you get once you've gone through all the tiers? You're not magically going to be able to read Virgil off the page perfectly as a result of this tier, because the purpose of this tier is to be able to access Virgil and the Aeneid when it's above your level. So let's say you need to be at level 8 Latin, whatever that means. Let's say level 8 Latin to be able to read comfortably the Aeneid without too much support. Maybe you look up some of the references or something or allusions, but beyond that, you can just read it off the page like English, basically. Let's say you need to be at level 8 for that. But if you're at level 5, well, then it's above your level. And so what the tiers do is allows you step by step to basically make the level 8 text much more comprehensible, so that at least in that sort of comfortable situation of the 4 tiers, you can understand it bit by bit, bite by bite. But when you actually just go to the text, of course, when you're outside of that tier structure, you're going to forget a lot of the vocabulary that was comprehensible in those 4 tiers, because you're not going to remember every single synonym that was mentioned unless you deliberately actively memorize it. I'm sure there will be references you'll forget, and just some of the syntax and the structure you're not ready for yet, because the whole thing is that it's meant for people who are not quite at the level to read it unassisted. So when I read the 4th book, I definitely did not understand everything. It was definitely like above my level, but I understood a lot. I remember I could just read a lot of it off of it, and I could just understand it. A lot of the imagery I remembered and understood and could just read, and a lot of the vocabulary I still remembered. And so clearly I learned a lot going through it. But again, it's not a magic wand that will magically allow you to read the Aeneid. Now, you could go back and reread it many, many times and essentially memorize the constructions and the syntax and the references and the synonyms and all that stuff. You could do that, but that would be because your goal is to understand book 4 really well. I think that's a slightly separate goal than just improving your Latin ability, because you can learn just because you understand the text better doesn't necessarily mean you're going to acquire more as you reread and reread. You will a little bit, but again, the question is your goal to improve your Latin more, or is your goal to understand this book more? And I think those are slightly 2 different goals, because your goal is to get up to level 8 and you're still at level 5. And so even if you essentially memorize this book and can understand it perfectly, you're still not up at level 8 to be able to read whatever book of the Aeneid unassisted. So if your goal is to just improve your ability to read Latin, then this should be part of that journey. But of course, just by memorizing this text isn't going to get you to it. You have to read a wide variety of text, of prose, and to build a vocabulary, and of course poetry to understand the syntax intuitively. That's not a criticism of this book in any way. We want to be realistic about what a tier reader can do. It's not going to give you that level 8 Latin automatically. Again, I'm making up this concept, but you're not just going to earn level 8 Latin just by doing the tiers, but you will improve whatever level you are at. You will improve your ability because you're being exposed not only just to a lot of simple Latin, which is very comprehensible, which is always good. You also are exposed to actual authentic poetry in a very comprehensible way. It's almost like a teacher guiding you through the Aeneid. I mean, it is literally Carla Hurt essentially guiding us through the Aeneid. And by making it comprehensible, you'll learn vocabulary, you'll learn different ways of expressing things. And again, even if you're not actually at level 8 at the end of that process, you will have learned a tremendous amount, and your just overall level of ability has risen, maybe to 5.5 or 5.75 or whatever. Again, it's not a magic wand. It's not going to automatically make you be able to read Virgil off the page like English, but it will do an incredible amount to improve your ability, understanding of the language, and also give you the confidence that Latin is not some magical code that you have to struggle over, that it is possible to just read it off the page like English. And that's very cool. Gives you kind of a glimpse of what that will look like in the future once your ability has risen up to it. Now, in terms of criticisms, not a lot. There was maybe 2 typos I saw in the whole book. I think ecce on one page was misspelt, and maybe one other little typo or formatting slightly error. But it was at the rate, like, you would see that amount of typos in literally any published book, Latin or otherwise. So other than that, it was extremely professionally put together and well edited, of course. Jessica McCormick edited it and did clearly an amazing job. Again, I'm not good enough at Latin to necessarily tell if all the grammar is correct. I mean, it seemed good, but very professional overall. I'll also say the bonus stories at the beginning, they were certainly functional and good, but I didn't find them particularly delightful. They were just fine. They just did the job of giving us a little bit of the backstory of the previous books of the Aeneid and any information about Dido and stuff. Like, that's what I got from it. Again, not really a criticism so much, but that's just one thing I noticed. Okay, so let's wrap up in terms of this book. Okay, so now I'll give my overall thoughts about the book in general. So one of the reviewers of the book on the book jacket said something like, "This is the reader we've been waiting for." And it's not hyperbole. I think this is what we've been waiting for in terms of super high quality, professionally written and edited intermediate text for learners. And that there's not necessarily a lot of these out there. Yes, there are novellas, but from people in the know, it seems like the quality is a little bit iffy in terms of proofreading and editing and even just language quality. I don't have a strong opinion about that. I haven't really read many novellas or other readers. That's what people seem to believe. From everything I can tell, this is one of the best readers that exist currently on the market, and that it should be in the library of every intermediate reader of Latin. Again, right up there with Fabulae Facules and Epitome Historiae Sacrae and those other classic readers. And again, those ones range from like hundreds of years old to like 100 years old. This is like something new that can go toe to toe with that, and that's really great. So again, the question is, who should read this? Like, what level should you be at? It's hard for me to say, but if we look at my reading list that I've talked about on this channel before, I would put it again in the ad alpes level, roughly speaking. I don't think you should necessarily jump into The Lover's Curse right after Familia Romana or the equivalent textbook course. I think you should read a bunch of other simpler readers first, but I think it fits comfortably around once you're about ready to start Roma Aeterna or Ad Alpes, roughly that level. And you might be thinking, well, how does that make sense? Because the Virgil is obviously much more difficult than, again, even this stuff, like the Bible or medieval Latin and conversations and stuff. Well, again, Virgil is not at this level. Like, actually, unauthentic Virgil is much, much more challenging than a lot of this stuff. When it's in the tiered reader context, it's much more comprehensible and appropriate in the situation. Again, it's for people in stage 3, as I call it, or like level, whatever level you're at, who's not actually at that level, and the tiers create that bridge. So my intuition is that it belongs in this area. So if you're at a lower level, you might consider still getting the book and just only read the first couple of tiers and then save the rest of it for another day or when you're a little bit stronger. So there's that. Yeah, so and then finally, of course, you can get the book for free. It's available if you just sign up for Carla Hurt's newsletter. If you go to foundinantiquity.com/The Lover's Curse, you can just sign up for her newsletter and you can get it 100% for free, a PDF or an ebook. So I would recommend buying it. I would recommend either donating some money to her Patreon or buying a physical copy. I did actually buy a physical copy of the book. It's not that expensive, and I don't have it here, unfortunately. I left it in another building, so I can't show it as a prop, but I swear I did buy it, and it is 100% worth the money, especially in terms of dollar per word. That there are 30,000 words approximately in this reader, so that's a mixture of the original Aeneid and all these tiers. And for $16.99, that's a very, very good deal. Familia Romana is about 30,000 words, I believe, and it's more expensive than that. And the vast majority of novellas, you're paying like $10-15 for like few thousand words, so not even close to 30,000. So in terms of dollar per, the value of this book is very high compared to, say, the entire competition. Like, I want more books like this. I want to pay $16.99 for 30,000 words. I don't want to pay $16.99 or $24.99 for like 10,000 words or 8,000 words. It's not enough for the money. And that's always been my main critique of novellas. But this is definitely very good value, and it supports extremely high quality resources, because I'm sure Carla Hurt spent hundreds and hundreds of hours on this, and just in terms of time invested, that's the equivalent of thousands of dollars invested, not to mention the editing process and other things that is also expensive. Will she be able to recoup her time investment as well as actual real monetary investment? Hard to say unless people actually support the work. So I do encourage people to buy it. For not only it's a delight to read. Like, yeah, you can read it on your Kindle or on your computer, but actually reading the text itself is a lot of fun, especially if you're used to just reading on your computer. Just reading an actual piece of paper and actually just turning the pages and enjoying the story It's delightful, and it's very self-contained, meaning that all the words in the back are defined like just in a dictionary. And what's nice though is that often in Latin there'll be words will have multiple definitions, but the specific nuance or definition that's relevant to the Aeneid is in the back. So in a way, it's better than something like Wiktionary or Lewis and Short or whatever dictionary you might use, because it gives you the precise nuance and definition that's applicable to that passage. Just to sum up, I highly encourage you to check it out. At the very least, sign up for Carla Hurt's newsletter and get a free copy. But I do highly encourage everyone to try and buy a paperback copy if you have the means, or get your library to order it, or get your teacher at your school to order a copy, because it's just really high quality work. It's lovely and fun to read, and it supports more creation of these resources. Carla Hurt has already have plans to adapt book 6 in the same way, in a near tiered format. And that's very exciting, and I will be first in line to buy it because it is excellent work. So congratulations all involved, and I encourage you to check it out. All right, bye.